Welcome to Veritate with your host, Johnny Mack, a podcast that will dive deep into the pursuit of truth in a world filled with noise, confusion, and fleeting opinions. We will seek to uncover the eternal, unshakable truths that shape our lives and our beliefs, from faith and philosophy to history and culture. We'll explore the questions that matter, challenge the answers we've been given, and seek the wisdom that has stood the test of time. So join Johnny Mack in this journey to discover what's real, what's right, and what's true.
Welcome back to Veritate, Episode 2. I'm your host, Johnny Mack. Now, the last time I kicked things off by sharing how I went from studying every religion under the sun to finally planting my flag with Christianity. Now, it wasn't some overnight epiphany. It was a slog through doubt, questions, and a whole lot of evidence, as I discussed before. And I had several questions that came up in regards to two of those things that I spoke about on the last episode, which was the Shroud of Turin and the Sudarium of Oviedo. So I want to pick up that thread and I want to take a deeper dive into what flipped that switch for me. Those two artifacts came up, and as I said before, these aren't just relics, okay? These are lightning rods for faith and skepticism. So we're going to unpack them step by step. So just grab a cup of coffee because this is going to be a ride. I'll be honest. I started off as an atheist and I grew up that way. And my dad was that kind of guy, who would roll his eyes at all these churchgoers. And he thought that they were chasing fairy tales. So I bought it hook, line, and sinker. No proof Jesus existed. Fine by me. And I remember being a Gen Xer glued to the TV when the Shroud of Turin hit the news. So this was late 70s, early 80s. Saturday night specials, grainy footage, scientists in lab coats. I remember the STURP team presenting the Shroud of Turin's research project, okay? And so they dropped this bombshell about how the Shroud of Turin was a forgery. And that word kind of stuck in my craw. Remember, I'm a little kid at this time, so I'm probably, 8, 9 years old, so that's going to put us somewhere about mid-80s. But forgery is a word that you use. That's what you call a fake Picasso or a forged check. Not something that you would call a burial cloth. But remember now, as an atheist, I ate this up. Because if it debunked Jesus, I'm all in. And that's human nature, right? So we cling to what fits our story. So there's an old saying that I love. It says, when you've done wrong for so long and you called it right, the real right feels wrong at first. And that was me, dismissing the faith without a second thought. But you see, something nagged at me on this one. If it's all fake, why is it still debated? Okay, so now keep in mind, I'm a young kid. Everything in my environment says that this is a forgery. My dad's an atheist, so they kind of complement each other. There's no reason that if you're such a young kid, but you're kind of compelled by this because as a kid, you're drawn into what seems to be a fairy tale. But when you see something that says, well, this is not it, and my dad's using this as like a confirmation that he was right the whole time, then that becomes solidified in you. You don't question this. And so the thought that I had again now through my teenage years was, so if it's all fake, why is it still debated? Why not just toss it in history's trash bin? So I started to dig into this. Now, it wasn't an immediate dig because remember, at the time, if you're an atheist and you're just living your life of thinking, all I got to do is be a good person and that's all I got to do, it's not something that's going to call to you. Like, why would you even remotely pick this Bible up? Why would you even go and join this group of people? Why hear about it? But there were questions. Like, there were lots of questions. So Mama Margie, being the Protestant Baptist, one of the things that she would always point out was that, the King James Bible, that's the one. I don't have any questions about that. Okay, everyone in the South is going to tend to agree, especially if they're Southern Baptists. But no one ever brought up that question, who wrote the Bible? And why is there a King James? Why is there an NIV? Why is there a Catholic version? And so I had to ask my old babysitter, Mama, as you know, that's what we call them in the South. She'd clutch onto this King James version and swear that anything else was heresy. So I realized really quick growing up that everyone's kind of got their own favorite version, and it depends on who you ask. So that could have derailed me, but I decided to sidestep the Bible rabbit hole and zero in on that evidence because that's the hard stuff, right? So as I was unpacking all this stuff, now keep in mind now, we're talking 30 plus years of believing that this was all fairy tale. So the Shroud of Turin, there was like these constant little, I don't know, let's call them nuggets along the way, right? The Shroud of Turin would come up. I would hear something about the church in Turin, Italy is going to put it on display. I think they do that like every 20 years. They'll put the shroud out for display. People will go and worship. And I thought, if that thing's been debunked, why are people going to visit it, right? Like that's the thing. But then you start to dig a little bit deeper at this thread and you find out that the Shroud of Turin is the most studied artifact ever, religious or not. Because I would dare say you've heard of it, okay? It's a 14-foot linen cloth. It's got a faint image of a crucified man. Now, the Sudarium of Oviedo is less famous because it's a smaller cloth. It is blood-stained, but there's no image on it, and it's kept in Spain. So both of these get tied to Jesus' burial. Both have folks arguing over them for centuries, and I don't know about you. I don't want opinions, okay? I want facts. So let me walk you through what I found. And you can check these sources for yourself. And I will point to where you can look these things up. So first up, there is the Shroud's radiocarbon dating. In 1988, a team led by P.E. Damon published in Nature. He cut a postage stamp piece from the corner near the feet, and it was said that they dated it between 1260 and 1390 AD. Medieval. Case closed, right? Not so fast. You see, the sample came from an edge that had been repaired after a 1532 fire in Chambéry, France. The shroud was stored in a silver case, and the fire melted it. It scorched holes into the cloth. Nuns there had patched it with a medieval thread, cotton, not linen, and it was woven into the original fabric. And then researchers like Joe Marino and Sue Benford, writing in 2000 for the Shroud Research Conference, they showed this sample was a mix of old and new fibers. So that skews the carbon dating. And Raymond Rogers in 2005, in a paper, Thermochimica Acta, confirmed with chemical tests that the repaired fibers were dyed to match the core cloth's older. How old? We'll get there. Now rewind back to the 70s. Max Frey, a Swiss botanist, studied the pollen that was trapped in the shroud, and he found grains from 58 plant species, many of them from the Middle East, like Gundelia torniforti, a thorny plant found around Jerusalem. That plant is not found anywhere outside of Jerusalem. And critics say pollen can drift, but you see, Frey's work, backed by later studies, suggested it's not just random contamination. So it's a fingerprint of where this cloth has been. So then in 1982, you've got the Sturps, Rogers and Schwab. They dig into this image itself. They find no paint, no dye, just a yellowing on the topmost fibers, like a scorch, but it's not burned through. No brushstrokes, no pigment traces. How do you fake that in the 1300s? So now, same year, Ercoline, Jumper, and Jackson, they publish in Applied Optics. They found image encodes, 3D data. They shine light on it, and it's like a relief map of a body. Medieval artists were not doing holograms, okay? You fast forward to 1981, and Adler and Heller in the Canadian Society of Forensic Science Journal, they tested the bloodstains. real human blood, type AB. And that's a rare blood type, okay? That's only about 3% of people. They find a high bilirubin content, and high bilirubin is bilirubin is a chemical spike from trauma, like getting beaten and nailed to a cross. And the stains on the shroud match the gospel wounds. So the wrists, the feet, the side, the head. And it's not smeared like paint. It's precise, like a contact print. Okay. The Sudarium, been in Oviedo, Spain, since at least the 7th century per the historical records from the Cathedral of San Salvador. And there's no image on it. It's just blood and fluid stains from a head wound. And in 1998, Wanger and Wanger, writing an article in History Today, they compared it to the shroud. And what do they find? Same AB blood, same wound patterns. They lay the Sudarium over the shroud's face, and the stains align. The nose, the forehead, the cheeks. 2 cloths, 1,000 miles apart, telling the exact same story. Now, a forger in Italy wouldn't know about a relic in Spain, let alone be able to match it perfectly. Here's the kicker. In 1898, Segundo Pia, he takes the first photo of the shroud in a dark room. And then the negative image pops out. There's a face clearer than the cloth itself. Now, a medieval painter wouldn't have a plan for photography 500 years before photography is invented. That's nuts, okay? And in 2004, 2 Italian researchers, Fanti and Maggiolo, they published in the Journal of Optics that they found a second face on the shroud's back, front and back images, full body, with scourge marks that match a Roman flagrum, 120 lashes per forensic counts. The 120 lashes, by the way, could also be reduced down to, if you know how a flagrum is formed, depending on the number of lashes that come out of the flagrum, it would still be consistent with 40 lashes, right? Because 40 times 3 would be 120. So per forensic count, 40 lashes from a Roman flagrum. So then they find the soil that's on the knees and the feet. They find a limestone composition just like Jerusalem's Damascus Gate, where tradition says Jesus walked to Calvary. And Natowski in 1986, Shroud Spectrum, studied, and he pins it down to being that composition that was found at the Damascus Gate. And 2005 Rogers microscope work showed the fibers too aged to be a medieval fake. Some degrading like ancient linen, not 14th century weave. Jumper in 1984 UV test confirms the image sits on the surface. It doesn't soak through like paint would. How do you fake that without modern day technology? And then you have the weave itself. Fleur Lindbergh, 2003 textile analysis found a 3-to-1 herringbone twill, which was used in antiquity in the Middle Ages. Now, skeptics will say, see, that's medieval. But ancient Jewish burial cloths, like those at Masada, they use similar patterns. The fire damage and those nuns' repairs explain that dating mix-up. So now let's pause. There is a dozen plus studies for pollen, blood, 3D imaging, and soil. It's not just trivia, it's a puzzle. And critics can say it's a clever hoax, but the how is what stumps them, because no one can replicate this. Not with lasers, not with chemicals. And the Vatican, which owns the shroud, they don't call it authentic. They just call it a mystery. Fair enough. Right? But for me, it's more than that. So I want you to think about that. The Vatican doesn't call the shroud authentic. They just call it a mystery. It would seem to me that if the Vatican wanted to reinforce it, they would say, oh, this is real. Why do they not do that? Because it's not necessary. Number one, not necessary. You can study it for yourself. It's called a mystery. And so therefore mysteries are for you. It's not enough to be able to plant a flag and say, well, it's real because we say it's real. No, it's a mystery. Then you solve it. And that's where it gets personal. Because I had been wrestling with this stuff, facts piling up, skepticism crumbling. And then I hit Paul on the road to Damascus, okay? In Acts 9, Saul's hunting Christians, and he's full of fire and fury. And then all of a sudden a light blasts him, brighter than the sun, it says. And he drops, blind, and he hears, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? 3 days later, scales fall from his eyes, and he's Paul, apostle of Christ. Now, it's not that story, it's the light that stuck with me. The Shroud's image, some say it's a radiation burst, a flash of light that kind of etches the linen without burning it. Fonte's 2012 experiment with UV lasers got close, but not exact. Still, think about it. A body vanishes in light, leaves a mark, and then years later, right? Paul's blinded by light from the risen Christ. Coincidence? I couldn't shake it. That led me to Jesus' own words in Matthew 16. He asked Peter, who do you say that I am? Peter says, you're the Messiah, the Son of God. And Jesus tells him, only my Father in heaven could reveal that to you based on what you know of me. Folks, that hit me like a truck. Evidence, Shroud, Sudarium, history, all piled up. Eyewitnesses like Paul saw him alive. Experience told me dead men don't do this. Faith wasn't blind anymore. It was knowing. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. It's John 14:6. If he's truth itself, not just speaking it, everything tied to him holds up. The shroud, the Sudarium, the cross, the church. It's not true because I believe it. It's true because it's like 2 + 2 = 4. That doesn't need my vote. Okay? The nature of 2 + 2 is 4. It was 4 before you were born, 4 today. It'll be 4 after you're dead. It doesn't matter if you, I think 2 + 2 is 5. It doesn't change anything. It is 4, right? It is what it is. It's an absolute. In fact, mathematics even points to the realm of an absolute. What is the absolute value of positive 2? Just 2. What is the absolute value of negative 2? Just 2. What is 2 + 2? It's 4. It's not up for debate. Okay? It's a fact. So let's dig a little deeper. Okay? So the Shroud's history is wild. Tradition says that it left Jerusalem after the resurrection, it moved through Edessa, which is modern Turkey, by the 2nd century, and a cloth called the image of Edessa pops up in records, folded to show just the face. Sound familiar? By 944, it's in Constantinople. And Emperor Constantine mentions a sindon with blood and an image. Crusaders loot it around 1204. It resurfaces in France by 1357. And it was owned by Geoffrey de Charny. And then Turin in 1578. Gaps? Sure. But the trail's older than 1260. That's the point. Now, the Sudarium's path is a little bit tighter. It flees from Persia around 614, lands in Spain via North Africa. Documents from Oviedo's Bishop Peleo in the 12th century called it Christ's face cloth. 2 relics, 2 journeys, same blood. Skeptics still fight it. Walter Macron, my microscopist. He claimed in the 1990s it was painted with iron oxide and gelatin. But Stirp had already debunked that. There was no pigment mass, just blood and fiber stains. And others say the carbon dating's enough. It's medieval. End of story. But they dodged those repairs. The pollen, the 3D data. I get it. Accepting this shakes things up. Because if it's real, Jesus wasn't just a guy. He is the guy. And there's one more angle. And this one is, for me, this one is the most compelling when you understand. Listen, as I told you before, language is important. Okay, language, how things are said in different languages. And I don't know how many of my listeners here are bilingual or trilingual, but most people that speak multiple languages know that when you speak foreign languages, there are things that can be said in a foreign language that there is no equivalent to in English. The words, you have to kind of get close, but you can't mimic certain words. There's certain words in Spanish that a prime example is like the word órale, right? Órale, it has several different meanings, and depending on the context in which you've used that word, if you just were to say the word in English, órale would be like, read it. But there's no good way of saying it in English because you'd have to know the context in which it was used. And a lot of words are like that, especially when you start looking at older languages, because older languages, they mean what they mean. And now English is an alive language, meaning that words change their meaning. For example, you and I talking right now, you've heard your kids use the word literally. And we know, Gen Xers know, that there's another word. There's literally, there's figuratively, right? But a lot of the times you have kids today, even adults today, who use the word literally to mean the opposite of it, figurative. And in our lifetime, the word literally has literally changed to mean its opposite, figuratively. So when you have a word like that even in our own lifetime has changed its meaning, even more so the longer that time goes on, which is the reason why it's important to go back and look at language at the time that it was spoken. One of the reasons why Latin is an official language that is used by the church, the reason why it is used by science, the reason that it is used by law, is because Latin means what it means. It's a dead language. It's no longer in use outside of the realms of science, law, and church. So those words mean what they mean. When you have to have these different versions, it's because the language has changed. And now all of a sudden we have to put the words in a new context in order to be able to try to understand what was going on. So you have two methods of going about it. One is increase your knowledge so that when you go back and you can read that language and you start to understand what does that mean, rather than someone else saying, well, let me just change all of the words and I'll tell you what I think it means. And I think that's the current issue that we have today, even amongst Christians, and why we have 5,000 different versions of the Bible, is because everybody wants to interpret the words to mean what they want it to mean. But I happen to believe we don't get to reinterpret 2 + 2 is 4. I may be able to change the language and put 2 + 2 is 4 in Spanish, but that will not change the value or the outcome. But if I'm allowed to play with these words and I'm allowed to change what they mean, then I can change entire context of what was written when it was written and what was said when it was said. So I'm going to take you back now to the trial of the midnight trial of Jesus, when he is before the Sanhedrin in this illegal trial. The Jews were not supposed to hold this trial. And Caiaphas is at it. And the high priest demands from Jesus. We're in John chapter 18. Okay. The high priest demands, are you the Messiah? And Jesus doesn't dodge this question. He says, I am. In Hebrew, the word he used is Yahweh. That's God's name from Exodus 3:14. I am that I am. Now listen, no Jew threw that around lightly. You do not utter that word. That is not a word, especially not to the Sanhedrin and Caiaphas. And yet Jesus, who I had always said never said that he was God, he made it unmistakable by saying, are you the Messiah? Yahweh. Caiaphas, read it. Caiaphas tears his robe and immediately is angered, and he says, blasphemy. And the death sentence follows. So Jesus just doesn't claim messiahship here. He's claiming divinity. And that's why they nailed him up. And believe it or not, it doesn't change what happened. It changes you. So where's that leave us? Okay. I'm not here to sell you a relic. The Shroud and the Sudarium are not salvation. They're just signposts. But for me, they bridge the doubt to faith, facts to knowing. I don't just believe Jesus rose. I know dead bodies don't vanish in light, leaving images and transformed lives unless he's who he says he is. History backs it up. Science wrestles it. Scripture seals it. So if you've got thoughts, questions, you hit me up at veritate@yahoo.com and I'll tackle them the next time because we've got more to unpack. Like Jesus' question to Paul, why do you persecute me? And where the church fits in. But for now, chew on this. Truth doesn't bend to what we want. It just is. Until next time, God bless you.
Thank you for listening to Veritate. If you would like to contact the show, please email us at veritate@yahoo.com. That's veritate@yahoo.com. Thanks again, and we look forward to hearing from you. May God bless you all.